Thank you so much, Saburi-san, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be physically at Rieti in Tokyo. This is the first time I'm here since the pandemic, and it's a fantastic city, and your weather is much better than ours in Brussels. So I'm very happy to be here. So let me just give a little bit of background about this topic. So at Bruegel we have quite a lot of work on decarbonization within Europe, within the European Union. So we have contributed to the debate on the European Green Deal, most recently through a paper on the governance of the European Green Deal, which is complicated because we have many governments, we have the European Union, and so it's not easy to steer Europe to meet its emission reductions targets. But this talk focuses on another dimension which has not been emphasized as much in Europe, even though I think it is at least as important, and that is what we can do as advanced countries, specifically what the EU can do, but also with its international partners to accelerate decarbonization in emerging and developing economies. So let me motivate this a little bit. I will show you 4 charts for motivation and derive some implications. I will then talk you through 2 sets of instruments to provide incentives for EMDE, emerging market and developing economy decarbonization, and then I will conclude. So this chart is taken from last year's synthesis report on nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and it shows how the nationally determined contributions until 2021 influence the likely temperature path. And the main point is, of course, that we are falling short. So according to this set of estimates, we will be above 2%, which is essentially catastrophic. On the other hand, it also shows that NDCs have been substantial. And so the reality is somewhere between saying it is enough, it is definitely not anywhere close to being enough, and to say that a voluntary process, which is the Paris Agreement, does not matter at all. Clearly, it matters quite a bit. So the pure view that without hard incentives, countries will do nothing is also wrong. They are doing something, but it is not enough. This chart is one way of decomposing emissions in the last 30 years or so, since 1990. And so basically it makes the point that the proximate cause of the areas of the world where emissions are growing fastest are emerging markets and developing countries. So the 3 curves at the bottom that are sort of gently sloping down are advanced countries. So this is the EU 27 is the orange line at the bottom, the United States, the blue line, the gray line is all other advanced countries. So Japan, Canada, the UK are in the gray line. And then we have these striking rises. The yellow line is Chinese emissions, and the green line is other developing countries and emerging markets. And so, from a point of view of reducing global emissions, it's clear we have to do something about the yellow and the green lines. And so that is the conclusion that you get to if you focus on absolute emissions. Emerging markets need to do much more than they are doing. But there is another way of drawing the same curves. So if you take exactly the same emissions data, but then rather than showing absolute emissions volumes, you divide them through the population. You see first that emissions per capita continue to be much, much lower in emerging markets than in advanced countries. Only China has now surpassed the EU on emissions per capita basis. And then with respect to the green line, it's not even rising very much. And so essentially what is happening here is that these rises in emissions are driven largely by population growth, not even by economic growth very much. And so from the perspective of someone living in that green part of the world, they will say, look, I'm barely producing any emissions per capita. Why do you want to start with me, right? And so that is the fundamental political and economic dilemma of decarbonizing emerging markets. It is hard to imagine how to decarbonize them without hurting their growth, or to avoid hurting their growth without taking some of the costs of this carbonization to the advanced world. This is a chart that shows just how far we might have to go to meet the Paris goals. So on the left, you see some net zero aligned emission pathways. Most of them, the blue line is the business as usual scenario, and you can see on the right chart that this would lead to cumulative emission pathways that by 2050 far exceed the existing carbon budget, consistent with 2%. So this would go beyond the 2%. So the dotted lines on the right is the total carbon budgets that we still have before we exceed temperature thresholds with 2/3 probability. The gray line at the bottom is the 1.5% threshold, and the line at the top is the 2% thresholds. Then if you focus on the orange and on the green lines, these are sort of estimates of emissions paths associated with the currently declared nationally determined contributions. So the orange line is what you get if you assume that everyone is going to reduce their emissions as they have promised. So these includes countries that do not have yet legislated these emissions into law. And the green line is also emission reduction promises. The difference between the two is that many countries have not said how fast they're going to do this. So some countries have declared percentage reduction targets in the medium term by 2030, and some countries have left them open. And the difference between the two lines is how we treat those countries in this computation. So in the orange line, the upper one, we assume that countries that do not have a declared percentage reduction target by 2030 or 2035, that they are simply going to follow business as usual, and only then will they linearly reduce emissions. Countries, whereas the green line assumes that countries that do not have explicit percentage reduction targets will still want to reduce emissions linearly. And so basically the lesson between those two is that the speed of emission reduction in the next 6 years, roughly, is going to matter tremendously for how much of the remaining carbon budget we still use up. So if you look at the right chart, the orange line, which is the cumulative counterpart to the one on the left, reaches up to the above 1.9%. So it is very very scary. The green line is further down. And then the remaining lines, we basically experimented with more ambitious plans to get to at least maybe 1.6, ideally 1.5. And so one alternative that we tried is what is called alternative one here, is what if the countries that currently have net zero targets beyond 2050, bring them forward to 2050, right? So this would include several emerging markets that have declared, given themselves more time. And so you can see this makes quite a big difference. But it's not enough to even get to 1.6, let alone 1.5. Then in alternative 2, we asked, well, what happens if in addition to that, the advanced countries that have currently declared 2050 targets bring them forward to 2045? The answer is almost no difference, right? And this has to do with the same effect, which is what really matters is what we do in the next 4 or 5 or 6 years. If you accelerate something from 2050 to 2045, it doesn't matter very much. And then we have 2 more radical scenarios. And in one, this is alternative 3, we asked, well, how much do we have to accelerate in the period until 2030 to get to 1.6? And the answer is quite a lot, and that is given by this kink in the brown line on the left. And if we want to accelerate to reach the 1.5, it's almost impossible, right? We have to radically cut from 35 gigatons to 10 within a period of 6 years, right? So 1.5 is essentially out of reach, but 1.6 may not be out of reach if we do something that is really focused not so much on the 2050 target, but on what we do in the next 6 years, roughly. So that is the main lesson from this. Okay, so the implications of these charts are that first we need accelerated emissions reduction, so with a focus on the immediate period before us to meet the Paris goal. So we are beyond the point where we could substitute, in a sense, between emissions reductions in this decade and the next decade. If we don't do it in this decade, we have missed the boat. At the same time, pushing this in developing countries is complicated by the fact that the carbon intensity per capita is low in most of these and will inevitably increase in the course of brown development. So we need a green development path. And finally, while necessary, accelerating emissions reductions in developing countries is not sufficient to meet the Paris goals. We will need an acceleration in advanced countries too. And finally, one idea, which is that, notwithstanding the fact that we need to do more in advanced countries as well, from an economic point of view, it is probably better to spend a larger share of the money that we use on developing countries simply because we're going to get a bigger bang for the buck here, right? And the reason is that the abatement costs in EMDEs are likely lower because obvious forms of abatement, like shutting down old generations of coal-fired power plants, have not happened yet because the opportunity costs are lower, factor costs are lower, and finally, in some cases, building green from scratch is cheaper than retrofitting. And so for all these reasons, the argument of this talk and a paper that we're writing on this is, let's really focus much more on incentivizing EMDE decarbonization. Okay, the question then is, how do we do it? And so in principle, there are 3 ways. This is one way of organizing the debate. Of course, there are others. We could do it through trade-based incentives. So this has a big tradition in economics, going back to a famous paper by William Nordhaus in 2015, the Carbon Club's paper. We could do it through financial incentives. So this is essentially conditional climate finance, also a long tradition. And I'm citing here a paper by a colleague of mine, Alissa Klein-Nienhaus, with 2 co-authors that push this in the context of getting out of coal in developing countries and around the world. And then finally, I think an approach that we need to think more about is international emissions trading based on differentiated emission reductions targets, so higher for advanced countries. And there's a very interesting recent paper by Beckers and Cariola that shows that this can potentially have big effects while avoiding making developing countries worse off, right? And that is, of course, what we have to do to make this economically and politically palatable. Now, in the rest of this presentation, I will go fairly quickly through the first and the second set and then conclude. So trade-based incentives, as I mentioned, start with the Nordhaus 2015 climate club idea. And so here the idea is that countries that have a high level of mitigation and maybe share an implicit carbon price form a club which is open to new members with equivalent level of mitigations. But if you have lower levels of mitigation, then you are hit with a tariff in order to trade, in order to export your goods into the climate club. And so what Nordhaus does is he figures out what kind of tariff magnitudes you would need to persuade members from outside the club to join. And the basic finding is that this would work. So you can create an incentives through trade that punishes the non-mitigating countries to an extent that they end up having to adopt your carbon price. So this is the attractive thing. But of course there are a few big problems. The main big problem is that you're making them worse off. And that would create a big political rift between club and non-club members. There's also the fact that this type of tariff would be illegal under the WTO. And finally, you need to decide, what is good enough in order to get into the club. But I think the big problem is the last bullet. So particularly in this day and age with the difficult geopolitics that we have, if, Japan, the EU, and maybe the US in the future, if they continue with strong climate policies, get together and form such a club and impose tariffs on emerging markets, then this would basically make our life politically impossible. It would make us lose allies. It would make us lose trading partners. So we don't want to do this. There is a more careful, softer version of this, which is border carbon adjustments. And so here, countries with carbon prices would charge either a tariff, a tax, or require emission certificates if they have emission trading systems, not to punish outsiders, but to ensure that imports pay the same carbon price as domestic goods. So to level the playing field in the domestic market. And of course, the main motivation here is to prevent leakage. So it prevents companies that are currently producing and selling domestically to move abroad in order to then re-import their goods into the domestic market. This is probably WTO consistent. It has to do a bit with the design, and this has been just introduced by the European Union as the first WTO member to do it. Now, the point is that, from the point of view of reducing leakage, I think this is a necessary instrument. It's not very strong because it does not make it still makes it more attractive to move abroad for the purposes of selling your goods outside the carbon price area. So it's not a panacea for leakage, but it ameliorates the problem. It does not, however, create strong incentives for mitigation outside the carbon price area. And the reason, of course, is that if you are subject to a border carbon adjustment, one thing you can do is that firms that have relatively high standards in the sense of having low carbon contents, they end up exporting their goods into the carbon price zone, but firms that do not end up exporting somewhere else. And of course, there's not much of an incentive to decarbonize processes in the country for non-traded purposes. For example, decarbonization of the energy sector may not really receive much of a boost here. This works better, of course, if it becomes bigger, right? So there is an argument, I think, to have something like this expand beyond the EU, if only to prevent leakage. Final point here, climate clauses and free trade agreements. So this is a big deal, particularly for the EU. So for a while now, we have included clauses in free trade agreements that are basically about asking the trading partners to protect environment or climate as a condition for access to the EU market. And, in part we do this because we want to avoid the impression that we want to trade with those areas primarily in order to exploit lower regulatory standards, right? We don't want a regulatory race to the bottom. But of course, by doing that, we are imposing our views on what environment or climate policy should be in those countries, and we are doing it in a way that's unlikely to be very effective. So they do not offer carrots because there is no financial incentive. And, as a stick, this is very strong because you would, in principle, have to suspend access to the common free trade area if countries do not follow through with their environmental commitments. But this blows up the entire idea. And so in that sense, it may not be very credible. At the same time, it can be politically toxic as a foreign interference in a domestic matter. And so one example for this is the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, which was substantially ready to be signed a few years ago, but has been held up by a clause requiring protection of the Brazilian rainforest. So the overall conclusion from this part is that these trade-based sticks are unlikely to be very effective because they either impose very strong and sometimes not credible costs on our trading partners, or in the case of border carbon adjustments, they do not pose very strong incentives. And so this leaves the second main block that I want to talk about, which is conditional climate finance. And here the idea is straightforward, which is we, the advanced countries, give financial support to the developing countries that we are asking to change their course of development in a green way for the benefit of the globe in exchange for mitigation measures. And so these could be direct financial incentives through grants and debt relief, official. It could be via multilateral development banks, or it could be through blended finance, that is by subsidizing private investments in green projects in those countries. You would want to do this not just to finance investments, but you would also and particularly want to do this to encourage policy reforms such as subsidies, carbon pricing, emissions regulation, protection of forests, and so on. And importantly, you would have to also be mindful of the opportunity costs of retiring brown assets. For example, people who work on coal mines losing jobs and having to be retrained. And this, of course, then gets you deeply into the politics of transition in those countries, which also means that you have to be tactful. Now, there are two big problems with this approach. One is how to monitor and enforce these conditions vis-à-vis emerging markets. Particularly in light of the fact that this is a politically sensitive set of conditions that you're imposing. And finally, there's a question of whether it actually makes sense for advanced countries to do this because from an individual country perspective, there is a collective action problem, right? So in the advanced countries, so we are trying to provide finance to prevent free riding in developing countries, but the provision of finance in itself creates a free rider problem because we are all hoping, the US will do it, or Japan will do it, the EU will do it, right? And so the question is, can we have a small enough group of advanced countries to address free riding so that, we have an understanding we have to do this together, this type of financial support, so an international partner group, while at the same time having a group that is big enough to really benefit from the avoided emissions that we are creating through this approach. So I'm going to have one slide on each of these problems, and then I will conclude. So my argument is that in principle we can solve both of these problems, right? So the monitoring or enforcement problem could in principle be solved First, by focusing on the country level. So this is the country platform idea that has been quite popular for a few years now. And the reason is quite natural. This is where you have a partner, which is a government. And since this approach involves policy, you want to probably establish relationships country by country. Now, when you do that, you want to have several parties involved that solve together the multiple problems of this approach. So you want to have a funding coalition of advanced countries, an international partners group that addresses the free rider problem. You probably want multilateral development banks and possibly the IMF involved to provide conditionality on the policy side, to establish some project selection criteria and to monitor that the country is following the promised policies. You definitely need local financial institutions for project selection. This is not something that EMDEs can easily do themselves. Of course, you need the international private sector as leverage, so through blended finance in particular. And finally, an important area where I think more work needs to be done, and some thinking is being done right now, is instruments and institutions to reduce exchange rate risk. So this has to do with reducing the cost of capital and making projects more attractive to international sources of finance. Now, this leaves sort of this collective action problem, and like I said, the idea here is that you want to pick the largest funding coalition that is still able to address internal incentives to free rides. So this could be the G7, maybe the G7 plus some smaller advanced economies. And if the benefits of conditional climate finance to this coalition exceed the cost, you have solved the collective action problem. And so I'm going to show you some calculations based on a paper by a colleague of mine, which is called the Great Carbon Arbitrage, that shows that such a coalition exists. So this table gives you the benefits, the net benefits of replacing coal with renewables in the countries that are shown in the left column, the recipient countries, from the perspective of the funding coalition by 2050. And this is expressed in US dollars, trillions of US dollars. So the net benefit is the cost of renewable investment plus the opportunity cost of paying for the early retirement of coal. So that is the cost you have to fund. The benefit is the social cost of carbon emissions that are avoided by replacing coal with renewables. And, you know, these are both very large numbers. And depending on the share of the world's social cost of carbon, so essentially on the size of the country that is paying for this whole operation, it can either be a huge loss-making enterprise, or it can be a profit exercise. The other assumption that determines whether this is in the interest of the funding countries is how much leverage you assume. Whether you assume that the public purse is paying this in full, or only half, or maybe only 20%, right? And so, by and large, many of these projects do not have to be subsidized outright. You just need to, in the sense of paid for by the public sector, you just need to lower the cost of projects. And one reasonable assumption is that many of these projects become profitable once the public sector covers about 20% of the investment cost. So I've given you here three assumptions. The public purse assumes the cost in full. In the advanced countries, it assumes half, or it assumes 20%, right? So the answer is that even in the most optimistic leverage assumption, which is you only need to put in 20% and the private sector does the rest, it would be never worth for Japan to do this on its own, right? It's simply too small, right? So according to the source that we used here, Japan has a share of about 3% of the world social cost of carbon. And so it only gets 3% of the world benefits, right? So you cannot ask a country that only gets 3% of the world benefits to pay for the entire decarbonization. you always get a negative number. Same for the European Union, right? For the EU, according to this estimate, the share in the world social cost of carbon is about 11%. For the US, it starts looking different because here the US is assumed in this paper is estimated to have almost 30%, 29% of the world social cost of carbon. And so this means that if you assume that the private sector covers half of the costs of carbon replacement, of coal replacement, it is already profitable for the US on its own to, for example, subsidize decarbonization in India, right? It would make a profit here of something like, okay, this is in trillions, so I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think this is 50 billion. But then if you put together essentially the G7 countries, you are there, right? So in that case, we collectively have close to half. We would have close to half of the world benefits of decarbonization, and that is definitely enough to make this whole thing worth it. And this means that as long as we can agree not to free ride on each other within the G7, maybe extended by the non-G7 EU countries, it makes sense to do this. Okay, so that is sort of the theory. Now, in practice, there's something that looks a lot like what I have just discussed, which is the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnerships that were started 2 years ago with the Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa, the so-called JETPs. So what are these? These are, first, in practice, political declarations, maybe 3 pages, 4 pages, involving an international partner group and a country. So it's a country-by-country approach, just like I have described. We have had these in 4 cases so far: South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal. The international partner groups for Indonesia and Vietnam are basically G7 based, so they include Japan. I think Japan is heading the Indonesia group, whereas the other ones were mostly EU and UK, or only EU, sometimes with UK and Canada. The focus of these JETPs is to phase out coal in the power sector, except in the case of Senegal, where it's about getting out of heavy oil, and South Africa has a somewhat broader objective. There it's also about the transport sector. How have these progressed? Well, in one country, you have a relatively detailed investment plan. There are secretariats, but it's fair to say no investments have yet happened under these. What is the aim? So in some cases, the aim is merely to fund an existing emissions reduction pledge. So South Africa has made an ambitious pledge, but has made it clear that it is not going to be able to follow through on it unless it receives adequate financial support. In other cases, like Indonesia and Vietnam, it's about making the emissions targets more ambitious relative to an existing pledge. So in those countries, it goes a little bit into the spirit of those simulations I showed you at the beginning, that by persuading countries to bring emission reductions forward, in the short run, you can make a meaningful impact on the probability of getting to or staying within the Paris objectives. Now, the big problem is that by any estimate, whether you take government estimates for these countries or whether you take the estimates from the paper that I used, these are hugely underfunded. So in the case of South Africa, the committed amount is 8.5 billion US dollars, whereas the needs, according to government estimates, are in the region, depending on how much you want to decarbonize, of 50 to 100 billion. And if you take the numbers of the Great Carbon Arbitrage paper, you get into 10 times as much, perhaps because this covers a broader set of decarbonization and includes opportunity cost. And the same story for Indonesia. So let me conclude. To reach the Paris objective, advanced countries will need to focus much more on creating incentives for decarbonization outside their borders in poorer countries. Trade instruments are insufficient to do so because they are either not very effective or will make developing countries worse off and create political discord. In principle, the way to go would be large-scale conditional climate finance in support of country-level decarbonization plans. And the beauty about this is that the impact, the climate impact of those country-level plans are sufficiently big to make it in the interests of advanced country coalitions of the size of the G7 and a bit more, perhaps, to actually pay for this. So this is rational from it's in the self-interest of those advanced countries. The problem is, and so it is an appealing concept, and probably because of that, we have started to see arrangements that look like it, but the gap between the practice of these arrangements and the principle remains very large. So in particular, the committed amounts are at least one order of magnitude too low. And it makes you then wonder, why are they too low? Well, part of it is their fiscal constraints, of course, but still, the numbers we are talking about are very small compared to the numbers that we are using, the finance that we are using domestically for much more expensive forms of decarbonization. And so I suspect that the reason why we are not doing this at scale has to do that we are not sure that it will actually work, that it will actually give us a big climate impact. And maybe that the promises are not ambitious enough. And so we will need to get out of this dilemma by trading higher finance for higher ambition with a very solid monitoring and verification system. Thank you, and sorry for speaking so long.